Hi, everyone, and welcome to Legal Management Talk, where we're covering every angle of legal management. I'm your host, Justin Askenazy. So we talk about cybersecurity around here a lot, and obviously because it's such an important topic. Today we're going to zoom in on an aspect of it that we haven't exactly covered before, and that is contracting with cybersecurity providers. And our guest today is Rob Scott. He is the co-founder and chief innovator of Monjur, which provides contracts as a service solutions to IT service providers. So first of all, thanks so much for being here, Rob. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to contracting, let's kind of start with a baseline. What is usually in a contract with a cybersecurity company? Like, what goes into it? What should firms be looking out for as they, try to find their provider?
Well, I mean, in most service contracts today are structured with a master service agreement or some set of general terms and conditions that are applicable to all transactions and engagements, followed by either separate service attachments for specific work streams or statements of work that set forth the scope of a variety of services. They could be either project services, consulting, or more frequently in the area of cybersecurity, a managed security service or ongoing service that expands over multiple periods and up to multiple years typically.
Yeah. And so I know, as with really any contract, there's regulatory legal things that have to go into it. What kind of clauses have to be in there to, be compliant legally?
Well, there's three sources of regulation that speak to, what kinds of terms and conditions need to be included, all focusing on access to or processing of regulated data. On the international side, there are regulations called GDPR that there's one version in the EU and one in the UK. And so those regulations can reach to the United States and could be a factor which would require standard contractual clauses. Similarly, in the United States, under HIPAA, GLBA, and CMMC regulations, which are vertical federal regulations governing healthcare, financial services, and government contracting, each require specific provisions. We call them data processing terms to be included within the customer contract when the service provider is going to have permitted access to any of that regulated data. And then finally, there's a large patchwork of U.S. states, many of whom are modeling their regulations after California's Consumer Privacy Act, which also similarly have requirements that certain terms and conditions be included in writing as part of any service agreements that implicate consumer privacy in those jurisdictions.
Yeah. And you mentioned terms and conditions quite a bit. And I think for a lot of people, when they hear that phrase, they think of, this long thing that I scroll through and say, yep, I read it. And then you're off. But for, when a firm is trying to contract with a provider, the terms and conditions are really almost just as important as the actual service they're trying to get when they're signing it.
Yeah, I would say that for sure that's true, regardless of how it's signed, whether it's a scroll through and check the box, a click wrap, a browser, which is a variation of an online, signing, or traditional, ink signing. The content is what really matters the most. And when it comes to a law firm, the most important thing to think about is the non-delegable duty to preserve the confidentiality of client information. And when it comes to doing that, there's a huge intersection between cybersecurity and cybersecurity services and the discharge of that obligation and the risk related to that obligation if something goes wrong. And so when you think about contracting with outside service providers, the key focus in my mind has to be those risk balancing provisions of indemnity, limitation of liability, and insurance, and how those all work together in the event that there is an incident that causes injury to the law firm or to its clients in terms of a potential breach or compromise of data.
Yeah, so let's talk about the risk mitigation aspect. What are some of the latest things you're seeing in terms of what's being put in these contracts to allow for risk mitigation, and what are service providers offering versus what firms are responsible for? So what's some of the latest that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I'll run down what I think are the core managed security services offerings, and then I can tell you which ones I think are emerging.
Sure.
The core is going to be EDR, XDR, so perimeter protection, the ability to detect and remediate threat attacks at the perimeter, advanced firewall configurations leveraging AI, multi-factored authentication is one of these newer things that's becoming sort of a core requirement, below which people could argue that you haven't done everything that you should have done. So if you're not using MFA, I would say that's an easy one to think about adding. Password management is a big one. Products like Keeper and others that manage passwords, I think, are emerging products. SOC, which is Security Operations as a Service, and SIEM, which is Security Information Logging, are both emerging. And depending on the size of the law firm, should be things that they should be considering or implementing. And SIEM is one of those that's definitely emerging. The Security Information Logging is one that we're seeing a lot of trending, as well as mail protection. The going beyond the native security features of 365 and looking at third-party encryption and other advanced email security options is probably one of the biggest trends we're seeing in cybersecurity. Of course, security awareness training and testing and tools that try to trick employees into clicking on things that they shouldn't as part of ongoing training are important aspects of the managed security services that we're seeing in the market today.
Yeah. And I know as we tape this, we're nearing the holidays, and it's prime time for a lot of scammers and people like that to try to target unsuspecting people, especially through text, emails. So I would imagine that that's a very large focus for any firm.
For sure. I would say that, if you think about the types of attacks that are most prevalent and that, likely to expose law firms to serious financial and operational implications, business email compromise is one big category, and ransomware attacks is the second big category. And both of them could have potentially catastrophic impacts on a law firm. And I would say that when it comes to business email compromise, critically important to work to mitigate those risks with policies, as well as advanced cybersecurity solutions around email protection. And when it comes to ransomware, strong cybersecurity hygiene is important, but not as important as backup and disaster recovery.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a good backup and disaster recovery system, there's no reason to pay ransomware. You just, move on with your, just recover your data and keep moving. So a lot of things to worry about in today's heightened threat environment, particularly for law firms that have, high stakes in terms of the obligation to protect customer information. And so it's very important for firms to be either employing those cybersecurity experts in-house, or for smaller firms, organizing a vendor ecosystem and tool sets to make sure that, to the extent possible, that they're following all of the recommended best practices to ensure that customer information is being protected.
So let me back up a second. And I heard you say the phrase cyber hygiene, and I'm curious about what exactly that is. What does it look like to be cyber hygienic?
Well, I think that there are degrees of it, but certainly, you can think about the existence of tools, processes, and procedures designed to safeguard customer information, and what extent, deliberately is the organization, implementing those policies, adhering to them, documenting their adherence through third-party audits and attestation. When you think about cyber hygiene, you're talking about an organization that has a high level of maturity in training, the right and cutting edge tools to protect their environment, as well as third parties that can attest to the sufficiency of their control frameworks and their ability to adhere to those on an operational basis through a SOC 1 or SOC 2 type accounting audit of those controls.
Yeah, I would think it would be very important to be able to audit these systems on a regular basis. What other kinds of things should you be looking for as a firm before entering into an agreement with a cybersecurity provider?
Well, again, I think risk balancing is critically important. That's indemnity insurance and limitations of liability. And on the area of insurance, if you're a law firm and you're hiring a provider, you want to make sure that there's adequate insurance to cover you in the event that something goes wrong, and that the limitation of liability doesn't preclude you from accessing that coverage. Because what you'll see a lot of times is a provider will have $3 million worth of coverage, but they'll have an agreement that says the recovery is limited to 6 months of the fees you pay. And so having appropriate carve-outs to make sure that there's adequate insurance coverage, and that the vendor at least stands ready to answer for any damages that it causes. Not that you're asking them to be the insurance company for everything, but at least to the extent that there are claims against them, they shouldn't be limited to in a manner that doesn't allow the customer to access at least the proceeds of their professional liability insurance. In addition, I think that if you're going to be outsourcing cybersecurity or not, you should have your own first-party cyber liability insurance policy. That would cover the firm in the event of any loss, regardless of who's at fault. And so what you don't want to do is get into a situation where you're relying on your vendors to bring insurance, and then you have an incident that's caused by maybe the negligence of one of your employees or the criminal act of a third party that wasn't the fault of the provider, and now you have no coverage. So getting your own coverage, requiring your vendors to have appropriate coverage, and then making sure that the agreements are being either written or reviewed by lawyers either within your firm or outside that have expertise in cybersecurity contracting, to make sure that the I's are dotted and T's are crossed related to the specific risks, exclusions, and obligations that are appropriate for contracts of that type.
Yeah. And obviously on the flip side, common mistakes that would happen when signing these contracts would be not doing everything you just said. But is there anything else that you've seen that, when it came across your desk, you're like, this shouldn't have happened. How could they agree to this? What are the kinds of pitfalls that should really be avoided?
Well, look, I think the agreement should be comprehensive. I know that there's a move toward shorter agreements and so forth. But when it comes to cybersecurity services, more attention to detail versus less is going to be more protective. And I think it's critically important to make sure that you have a thorough understanding, that both parties have a thorough understanding of who's responsible for what, and if there are any shared or co-managed responsibilities, that they're clearly articulated in writing. Because a lot of cybersecurity problems happen because the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Internal IT doesn't know what the service provider is doing. The service provider thought it was the responsibility of the IT people. And this is how you wind up with problems.
Yeah.
And so I think it's critically important they either get a single neck to choke and outsource to a single provider, or if you're going to have co-managed relationships and shared responsibilities, that all stakeholders understand those responsibilities and are bound to them through a written agreement.
Sure. And speaking of agreements, it's also relevant to AI, which everybody is focused on. And I know a lot of firms are trying to, ascertain what the best provider is for, legal AI services. And so at least when it comes to that aspect, what should they be looking for when trying to suss out the best provider for them?
Well, look, I think on the technical side, it's going to be, the same way you evaluate any solution. Does it meet your requirements? Does it fit your budget? Is the time to deployment what you're looking for? Do you have the resources to manage it and maintain it? So there's nothing unique that I have to add there. However, when it comes to the legal side of it, an AI project is not a standard IT procurement project. It's a whole new animal. And there's things that need to be defined that aren't typically defined in traditional services contracts, like output data, input data, the model, the algorithm, all of these things, the learnings. These are these are concepts that are uniquely defined in AI agreements that weren't being used, even a few years ago. So we launched our first service attachment for managed AI in March of this year, just to give you a sense of how new this is. But not only do new things need to be defined, there's a number of issues related to intellectual property and who owns what that are unique challenges for AI that didn't exist in traditional IT and software transactions before AI, because previously all of the IP was known at the time of contracting. With AI, uniquely, you have evolving sets of intellectual property, both in terms of the model, the outputs, the learnings, right? There's a lot that evolves over time, and who owns that and what they can do with it and who can use it and how become critically important when you're talking about contracting for AI services. In addition, the customer obligations, the provider obligations, and the exclusions related to AI services are much different. For example, we believe that both parties to a contract for AI should be contractually be bound to responsible AI and all that entails in terms of ethical AI and transparency, as well as exclusions. What happens if there's government regulation? Are there fair warnings about hallucinations and bias and other aspects that are unique to AI that need to be addressed in the contract to meaningfully protect both parties in the event of a dispute?
Yeah. I think just, to the untrained observer like I am, it must be so hard to try to enter into a contract with something that is evolving, by the minute almost, because you're really unsure what you're actually committing to.
For sure. And it's evolving. Whatever tools are on the marketplace today, there's going to be an infinitely broader set of tools on the marketplace in 6 months. And so many people are taking a wait and see strategy around AI. I think for law firms, the most important thing to do is figure out what can you do with Copilot and how can you do it safely from a perspective of client information. And I think, what's going to happen is most lawyers are going to wind up using AI in the context of Copilot embedded into their 365 suite. And the key is going to be to make sure that that data is preserved from a confidentiality and security perspective so that you can use the power of AI within your law firm, but still not disclose attorney-client privileged information.
Yep. Obviously, you got to find the balance between confidentiality and convenience. So, great. Well, I really appreciate you being here and sharing your insight on what is obviously a perennially important and difficult topic. So, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin. Happy holidays to you and all your listeners.
Thanks. Happy holidays to you as well.
Thanks.
And thanks to all of our listeners and subscribers for tuning in. Please be sure to give us a like on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also catch us anywhere you get your podcasts. And as always, you can learn more about ALA at alanet.org. Until next time.